Two killers shot a man while he ate his dinner. The man had tortured them both when they were boys. And the state of New York says it never happened. Sit with that for a second. A revenge killing in a crowded pub. A rigged murder trial. A priest who lied under oath to save two killers. All of it published as fact, sworn as fact, sold to Hollywood as fact, and not one piece of paper to prove any of it ever took place. Rewind, October 18th, 1996. A film called Sleepers opens in theaters across America and tells this exact story. It came from a book published in the summer of 1995, a bestseller so hot that Hollywood paid $2.1 million for the movie rights at auction in February of that year, months before it ever reached a shelf. That is around $4.5 million in today's money. The cover carried a promise. This is a true story. Hollywood gave you the myth. Here is what nobody has ever been able to give you. Proof. No trial transcript. No death certificate that matches. No case file. No docket number. No victim. Nothing. The author is Lorenzo Carcaterra, a crime reporter raised in Hell's Kitchen, the son of a convicted killer, a man who built a career on telling true stories other people were too afraid to tell. He swears every word of Sleepers happened, and says he only changed names, dates, and places to protect people who were still alive. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office searched its own records and said no case like it ever existed. Both of those statements cannot be true. This is the story of four boys, a stolen hot dog cart, a house of horrors upstate, and a murder trial allegedly sabotaged from inside the prosecution itself. It is also the story of the real Hell's Kitchen underworld those boys grew up inside, a world of documented bodies and documented money, because you cannot judge the myth until you know the world that made it believable. So here is the question to carry for the next 20 minutes. If Sleepers is a lie, why has nobody ever managed to kill it? And if it is true, how do you make a Manhattan murder trial vanish without leaving a single sheet of paper behind? Start with the neighborhood, because the neighborhood is the one part of this story nobody disputes. Hell's Kitchen in the 1960s ran from 8th Avenue West to the Hudson Piers, roughly 34th Street up to 59th. Irish and Italian families stacked into brick walk-ups. Longshoremen, doormen, bartenders, bookies. The docks fed the neighborhood, and the rackets fed off the docks. And over all of it hung a code older than any gangster. You do not talk to the police. Not ever. Not about anything. Lorenzo Carcaterra was born into that world in October of 1954. His childhood is not a mystery. He documented it himself in an earlier memoir, published in 1993, and the brutal center of it is a matter of public record. His father, Mario, served years in prison for killing his first wife. Remember that. The man who wrote Sleepers did not learn about murder from library books. He grew up with it at the dinner table. In the book, Lorenzo is a skinny kid everyone calls Shakes, and he runs with three friends, Michael, the leader, and the brain, John Riley, the joker, Thomas Marcano, Tommy to everyone, the loyal one, altar boys, all four, watched over by a young neighborhood priest the book calls Father Bobby. Then comes the summer of 1967, and the prank that ends their childhood. The boys snatch a vendor's hot dog cart, lose their grip, and watch it tumble down a subway stairwell onto a man at the bottom. He barely survives. If you have seen the film, you remember that cart teetering at the top of the stairs. The movie plays the moment almost exactly as the book tells it. What happens next is where the two versions of reality start to fight. A juvenile judge sends all four boys upstate to a place the book calls the Wilkinson Home for Boys. Carcaterra admits the name is invented. The sentences run from months to more than a year. And inside, the book says, the boys are starved, beaten, and sexually abused by the guards paid to protect them, a crew led by a man the book calls Sean Noakes. I am not going to linger on that. What matters is what the book says walked out of that building. 4 boys went in, 4 different people came out, and 2 of them came out with something switched off behind the eyes. That is the engine of everything that follows. Now step out of the book for a minute and into the documented world, because the streets those boys came home to were run by real men with real bodies behind them. The film gives you a boss called King Benny, a silent Italian power ruling the block from a dim social club. That is, the movie being gentle. The real power in Hell's Kitchen in those years had names that federal juries would come to know very well. First, the boys. The neighborhood sorted them the way it sorted everyone. Michael kept his head down, finished school, and did the unthinkable for a Hell's Kitchen kid. He became a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Lorenzo clawed his way into the newspaper business and landed at the New York Daily News. And John Riley and Tommy Marcano went the other way. By their 20s, as the book tells it, they were running a small crew called the West Side Boys, doing stick-ups and collections. 2 young men with bodies already behind them and no expectation of seeing 40. Hold all of that in your head, because one night in the fall of 1981, as Carcaterra tells it, the door of a Hell's Kitchen pub swung open and a heavy-set stranger took a table like he owned the room. Except he was not a stranger. Drinking across that small room were John Riley and Tommy Marcano, and the man who had just sat down to his meal was Sean Noakes. Their old guard from Wilkinson had wandered back into the one neighborhood on earth where his past had grown up, gotten armed, and stayed angry. 2 killers, 1 guard, 1 door about to close on all of them. But before those guns come out, you need to understand exactly what kind of men 14 years in Hell's Kitchen had built. Rewind to a man named Mickey Spillane. Not the writer, the gangster. Through the 60s, Spillane was the gentleman boss of Hell's Kitchen. He held court at the Market Diner on 11th Avenue, sent turkeys to widows at Christmas, ran numbers and loans, and kept the peace. His signature racket was pure Hell's Kitchen nerve, kidnapping. His crew grabbed mob, connected bookmakers, and moneymen, ransomed them back for sums that ran into the tens of thousands of dollars, and returned them alive with an apology, tidy, profitable, and it made the Italian families across town quietly furious. Then came Jimmy Coonan, and Coonan was the future. The feud was personal. Spillane's crew had kidnapped Coonan's father, a neighborhood accountant, and pistol-whipped him. So in 1966, 19 years old, Jimmy Coonan climbed onto a tenement rooftop with a machine gun and emptied the entire clip at Spillane and his men on the street below. He hit nobody. It did not matter. The whole neighborhood now knew his name. He did a short stretch in prison, came home, and started building a crew of dock kids and stick-up men that the city would come to call the Westies. Understand the economics, because this is the machine the Sleepers boys grew up watching. West Side loan sharking worked like this. The opportunity was simple. Dock workers and union men lived paycheck to paycheck, gambled hard, and no bank would touch them. The inside connection was the union delegate who pointed out which man was desperate that week. The execution was Friday collections, cash only, same bar stool every week. The money was the vig. 3 points a week was standard, so a man who borrowed $10,000 owed $300 every single Friday, just to stay even, while the $10,000 itself never shrank. And the problem was advertising. A loan book is only worth what fear makes it worth, which means somebody, sooner or later, has to get hurt in public. Coonan had a colder solution to the fear problem. Make the whole man disappear. The rule he repeated to his crew was simple. No body, no investigation. It worked every time except once, and that once tells you everything. May of 1977. Ruby Stein was one of the biggest loan sharks in New York, a soft-spoken money man who worked with the Italian families, and Jimmy Coonan owed him $50,000, roughly $250,000 in today's money. So the crew invited Stein to a bar Coonan controlled, the 596 Club at 596 10th Avenue. Stein trusted them. He walked in alone. A shooter stepped out of the kitchen and put him down at the bar while someone locked the door and closed the blinds. According to sworn testimony, every man in the room then put a bullet in him. Coonan personally demonstrated how to take the body apart. The $50,000 debt died with Stein, and his loan-sharking business became the prize. They made one mistake. Nobody cut the lungs open before the garbage bags went into the East River. Days later, the torso washed up on a Queens shoreline, and the whole town understood the message anyway. 8 days after Stein walked into that bar, on May 13th, Mickey Spillane was shot 5 times outside his apartment in Woodside, Queens, where he had moved his family to escape the war. Nobody was ever convicted. Everyone in the life read it as a favor from the Italians to Jimmy Coonan, and in the months that followed came the dinner that decided the next decade, Tommaso's Restaurant in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, sat down with Coonan and his baby-faced enforcer Mickey Featherstone, a Vietnam veteran with a hair trigger who had already walked away from one killing on an insanity plea. Castellano told them, in so many words, that the war was over and that from that day forward they were with the Gambinos. The price was 10% of everything, kicked upstairs forever. In return, the Gambinos would bankroll the Westies loan book and cut them into construction money, including the coming Javits Convention Center. Within a few years, the crew was even skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the ticket booths of the Intrepid Museum on the Hudson. The Westies walked out of that restaurant as the most feared Irish crew in America. That is the world. That is the code. A neighborhood where witnesses go blind on command and bodies learn to swim in pieces. Now walk back into that pub in the fall of 1981 and watch the door close. As the book tells it, John and Tommy watched Sean Noakes eat for a long minute. Then they walked to his table and asked if he remembered them. He looked up from his plate and waved the past away like it was nothing. Wrong answer. They reminded him exactly who they were and exactly where they had met, and then they shot him where he sat and walked out into the night. A room full of Hell's Kitchen regulars, and every single one of them suddenly remembered nothing at all. If you have seen the film, you remember the scene, the casual horror of it, the way nobody in the bar even moves. That part, at least, is true to how the neighborhood actually worked. One forensic detail cuts both ways. In the book, the medical examiner counts the bullet wounds, and the number is exact and brutal. In the real world, there is no medical examiner's report at all. Hold that thought. The book says the 2 shooters were identified and arrested anyway, and that the case went to trial. And this is where Sleepers stops being a revenge story and becomes something almost unheard of. A murder trial fixed from the prosecution table. Look at how the scheme allegedly worked. The opportunity came when the case landed in the Manhattan Homicide Bureau, and a young assistant district attorney volunteered to take it. Michael. Nobody in that office knew he had grown up with the defendants. Nobody knew he had been at Wilkinson. He asked for the case specifically so he could lose it. The inside connection was Father Bobby, the priest who had watched those 4 boys grow up and knew exactly what had been done to them. On the stand, the book says, he swore the 2 defendants had been with him at a Knicks game at Madison Square Garden on the night of the shooting, and in the film, he even produces the ticket stubs. A man of God, lying under oath. The execution was surgical. Michael built a case designed to die. Weak witnesses led badly. Soft cross-examinations. Doors left open for a defense attorney the book calls Danny Snyder, an aging drinker chosen precisely because a thrown case had to look like an honest loss. The money was the strangest part. Nobody collected a dime. The payment was 14 years of rage, settled in a courtroom that believed it was watching justice. And the problem, the fatal flaw in every fixed trial, is that it requires everyone involved to stay silent forever. The jury acquitted. Noakes was in the ground, John and Tommy walked free, Michael quietly left the law, and the perfect crime was complete. For 14 years, the silence held. Then one of the 4 wrote the whole thing down and sold it. The summer of 1995, Sleepers hits the shelves labeled nonfiction and takes off. And then reporters started doing what reporters do. The publisher called it a true story. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office called it impossible, saying its people had searched the records and found no case that matched. City juvenile authorities said the same. Priests at Sacred Heart of Jesus, the Westside Parish School Carcatera actually attended as a boy, were outraged and called the story false. The New York Times and the Washington Post went at the book and challenged virtually every detail in it. One wire service headline that summer called it nonfiction without the facts, and his answer never wavered. Of course, the records do not match, he said in interview after interview. He had changed the dates, the names, and the places to protect people, and the events themselves were real. The publisher stood behind him. The district attorney's office did not budge, and the trap closed from both directions at once. Either Sleepers is an invented memoir sold to the world as truth, or it is a real conspiracy buried so perfectly that even its paperwork obeys the code of silence. By the time the film arrived in October of 1996, the fight was open warfare. Catholic organizations condemned the story as a slander wrapped around a fabricated priest. City officials repeated, on the record, that no such case existed. Journalists asked for one document, one indictment number, one docket entry, one death certificate for the real man behind Sean Noakes. It never came. Watch the collapse in slow motion. Every archive searched came back empty. Every specific detail dissolved into a changed name or a shifted date the moment anyone reached for it. And yet nobody could ever prove the negative either, because sealed juvenile files and altered names make the story unfalsifiable by design. The man never blinked. 30 years of interviews, and his answer has never changed. It happened. Here is the contrast that should keep you up tonight. The real Hell's Kitchen underworld fell in exactly those same years, and it fell on paper. On April 25th, 1985, a Westie named Billy Bokun put on a wig to pass as Mickey Featherstone and shot a man named Michael Holly 5 times in the back on a Manhattan street in broad daylight. Featherstone was convicted of that murder in March of 1986 and handed 25 years for a killing his own boss had framed him for. So his wife Sissy went to the prosecutors, wired up, and taped Bokun talking about the wig. The conviction was thrown out that September, and Featherstone flipped on every man he had ever worked with. The federal RICO indictment came down in 1987, covering 20 years of crimes. The trial opened that September. Featherstone testified for 4 weeks, and in February of 1988 the verdicts landed. Jimmy Coonan got 75 years and a $1 million fine. Police and the FBI would eventually attribute between 60 and 100 killings to a crew that never numbered more than about 20 men. And every one of those crimes, no matter how carefully the bodies were hidden, still left a trail wide enough for a federal jury to follow. That is what real crime looks like on paper. It leaks. It always leaks. Sleepers is the one story from that world that never leaked a single page, which means it is either fiction or it is perfection. So what happened to everyone? By the book's own account, John and Tommy were both dead within a few years of the trial. Tommy murdered, John taken by the drinking, neither one old. Michael quit the law entirely and moved to England to work with his hands, the book says. The real Father Bobby, if he exists, has never been named. And Lorenzo Carcatera never recanted a word. He went on to write best-selling novels and spent years as a writer and producer on the television show Law and Order, a man who built a second career inside fictional courtrooms after telling the world about one real courtroom nobody can find. So here is the verdict on the film. What Sleepers got right, it got dead right. The Hell's Kitchen, it shows you. The loyalty, the rackets in the walls, and above all the code of silence, where a room full of witnesses sees nothing, is exactly the world the Westies ran for 2 decades, documented in federal court. The abuse at its center reflects something painfully real, because investigations across America have documented systematic abuse inside juvenile institutions just like the one on screen. And the trial it stages follows the book faithfully, the alibi, the ticket stubs, the sabotaged questions, beat for beat. But here is what the record cannot support. No verifiable trace of the murder, the trial, or the victim has ever surfaced. The names, dates, and places were altered by the author's own admission, so nothing on screen can be checked against anything on Earth. The institution itself is an invention standing in for a place he refuses to name. And the biggest distortion of all is the simplest one. It is the card at the very beginning, the one that tells you this is a true story, presenting as settled fact a case that the city of New York says never existed. In Hell's Kitchen, the first rule was that nobody talks. Sleepers is either proof that somebody finally did, or proof that the neighborhood's greatest storyteller understood exactly what the rest of us wanted to hear. If this one got under your skin, subscribe, because the documented side of this story is even darker, and the full episode on Jimmy Coonan and the Westies is coming. And tell me in the comments where you land. True story protected by the code of silence, or the most successful true story Hollywood ever bought. I read every answer.